Today I'm going to be using the Love You die, the Wildflowers stamp set, both by MFT. I showed you the dies, but I did not use them. We are going to be making a one-layer card here with a whole lot of masking. So I'm starting off with a piece of Simon Says stamp masking paper here, and I'm going to run that die through my Gemini just so that I have these letters. And I'm going to take a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 4¼ by 5½. And here I'm just kind of lining up my letters to see how they're going to fit on the cardstock before I actually adhere them down. I ended up, instead of having them go straight across, I did split them up just like the die is. So I'm going to take my T-square ruler and just draw a pencil line just to help me line up my letters there to make sure that they're all straight across. And I'll go ahead and adhere those down. The Love You will be separated, obviously. So I find it easiest to start off with the middle letter. So in this case, it's 4 letters, so there's no middle letter, but I'm starting off with the middle 2 letters just to kind of guide me as far as the center of the card panel, and then I will fill in the remaining letters. Same thing with the U. This is only 3 letters, so I do have a middle letter, and I'm just lining that O up the best I can to make it in between the O and the V above it. I did have to kind of play around with it, make sure that it was lined up correctly, and then I'll adhere the Y and the U. The U I had a little bit of problem with just because of the little pieces that come up from the U weren't straight. So I did have to kind of play around with that a little bit and finally got it into the correct position. So next we're going to go ahead and do our stamping, and I'm going to be stamping with blackout ink by Ink on 3, and we're going to do a whole lot of masking here. I've already pre-cut my masks using the Simon Says stamp masking paper, and I'm just going to stamp and mask as I go. So I'm starting off with one of the flowers here, and I'm going to kind of just fill in the entire area. I didn't cut masks for all of the images that I used. There's some like stems and things like that in the stamp set, and I didn't bother to cut masks for that. So I only cut the masks of these 2 flowers and 2 leaves, and that'll be pretty much my entire background, and then I'll fill in the rest with those ones that I didn't necessarily cut masks for. So here you can kind of see that I'm just kind of going around the entire card panel, concentrating on where my letters are. I will have them extend a little bit past the letters, but not completely. I will have some white space on either side of the card, on all 4 sides rather, and I'm going directly over the letters. Now you can use a stamp positioner for this, but you will want to make sure that you're giving it good pressure because you're going around those masks. You want to make sure that you're getting a good impression. You can always fix up any areas with a Copic safe pen before you do your coloring, but it's just easier if you give it nice and good pressure. So once I had all of my stamping and masking done, I'll move on to some of the images within the stamp set, like I said, that I don't have masks for, but I still wanted to use. So I'm going to use, there's one that's kind of like a, not a bud, but it's a smaller flower on the stem. And I'm not inking up the stem here because I don't want that to show through any of the gaps that I have. So I'm just kind of having this kind of hang off the edge. Same thing with this little leaf sprig, and then there's little berries or buds, whatever you want to call them, and I'm just going to kind of scatter those throughout the card panel itself. And then once all my stamping was finally done, I went ahead and removed my masks just from the flowers and the leaves. So I left the masks down where I had my letters. So when you're removing these, you just want to be super careful that you're not removing the masks from the letters. You can do this step first as far as outlining your letters, which I kind of wish I would have done because some of my masks started to come up a little bit with these other masks and they weren't as sticky, so they were kind of hard to go around. But I'm taking an EK Success journaling pen and I'm just going to trace around my masks. For the most part, with the exception of the O and the U, they're pretty much straight lines. So I didn't really have too much of a problem. You can see there on the L, I did kind of go underneath the mask. So you want to make sure that your mask is super sticky. That's why I use the Simon Says stamp masking paper. It tends to be a lot more tackier than most. If you're using like a post-it note or Eclipse masking paper, you may not be able to do this as easily just because they're not quite as tacky. So once I had the letters all outlined, I'll remove the masks for those and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. And I'm not going to show you all of the coloring. In fact, I did forget to press record for the first part of the coloring. So I did erase my pencil lines too. And you see there, I already had two of the flowers colored, but I'm going to show you the two yellow combinations that I used. Yellows can be really tough to shade with. So I like to mix in either an orange or even a brown to get my shading. So this one I'm going to be using more of an orange color for my shading here, and I'm just going to concentrate my darkest areas being in on the base of each of the petals and where one petal overlaps another. Then blending that out with my midtone. Now this is a Y marker, but it is more orange than it is yellow. Then I'll move on to more of a true yellow color, and then finally going in with my highlight color, which is a very bright yellow. So for the other color combination and the other way that I colored these flowers, I'm going to color this almost full flower. The U is kind of hanging off of it or over it a little bit. But again, starting off with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. And for this particular one, my darkest areas will be on the base of the petal, where the petals are over another petal, and also where the edge of the petal or the end of the petal is kind of indented. I'm just creating a U or a V shape just to kind of give that a little bit more dimension. Next, I'll go on to my darkest color here, and this is a YR marker, but it's more of a brown than it is orange. But it does blend nicely with the rest of the Y markers. So you can always do your shading with more of a brown color. And I'm just going to go over those areas that we mapped out as well as those little U's or V's that we had created on the tips of the petal. Then I'll go in with the YR24, which is one of my midtones, and just extend those flicks out a little bit further and make those U marks that we had created a little bit thicker, a little bit further down the petal, and a little bit wider. Then next going in with my lightest midtone and pretty much doing the same thing, just leaving a very small highlight on the tips of the petals, but going over those little U shapes that we had created on the tips just to kind of blend those out a little bit. Now, certain areas you may have trouble blending these, so you'll have to go over it more than once. Because my lightest color is such a light color, it's going to saturate the paper, so it's not going to look right immediately. So let the paper dry a little bit, and if you have to go over it again, you can, and you'll see later on that I do. Once the paper is dry, you can kind of see that it's kind of a weird color right now, but once that ink settles into the paper and the alcohol actually evaporates, you'll get a different result. So I went ahead and I colored the remaining flowers, kind of mixing up my color combinations. Now for the centers of the flowers, I'm going to use some E30 markers. I'm going to go over the entire thing with the E31, just going to go around the edges with the E37, and then just make that circle a little bit wider or narrower towards the center. And then blend that out with the lightest midtone and then the lightest color. And I'm going to do that for all of the centers of all of the flowers, just keeping in mind that my letters that are hanging over top of certain areas are going to cast a shadow. So I just chose my light source to be in the top right, so all of my shadows will be to the bottom left. So anytime there is a letter, one of the letters hanging over either the flower, the center of the flower, or the leaves, I am creating a shadow to the bottom left. But using the same color combination for all of these little middles of the flowers, just making sure that my highlight is right in the center, and this will make it appear that it's kind of raised up in the center of the middle of the flower. I don't know if that actually has a technical term. I'm sure it does. So once that was done, we'll move on to the leaves, and I colored these with the same color combination, just two different ways. So for the largest leaves that we stamped, they were a single stamp. I'm going to have my shading be on both ends. So on the base of the leaf as well as the tip of the leaf, leaving my highlight right there in the center. So this way it'll appear that the leaf is kind of bent and the middle would be, I guess, the part that is bent. So when I get to my YG03, I'm going to go over the entire thing because this is much a brighter green than the rest of it. I want to kind of brighten up the entire thing. For this other leaf where it's kind of like a stem with it, I'm just going to be doing some shading on the base of it and then up towards the center, but using that same color combination. And again, once I get to that YG03, I'll go over the entire thing to lighten that up. And I colored all of these leaves the same way, depending on which leaf they were. Now for these little berries, I'm gonna color them as berries. So I'm only using 3 colors here, and my highlight will be in towards the right, towards the top. So I'm just going to do a little C mark along the left, bottom left of each of these little berries with my darkest color. Then just thicken up that C, make that a little bit larger and wider with my midtone, and then fill in the rest of it with my lightest color. You can certainly leave white space in here, but for this particular image and the simple coloring that we're doing, I decided not to do that. So finally, we'll move on to the letters. I fixed up any messy areas because I was pretty messy with my colorless blender before we actually moved on to the coloring. For that bottom O, I didn't really do a great job of removing all of that yellow, so you'll see later on that that does kind of shine through, but that's okay. As a whole, you're not going to be able to tell. So I'm going to move on to some BG markers for my letters. I'm going to map out my darkest areas. So because we have a top right light source, we're going to have our shading to the bottom left. So I always start with my lightest color, not only to saturate the paper, but in case I make a mistake and put a shadow where I don't want it to be, it's easier to cover up. So next I'll go in with the darkest color and kind of just go over those same areas that we had mapped out where our darkest areas will be. And I'm not doing any flicking for the letters. I'm kind of just kept sticking to straight lines. And each time I go down as far as color goes, I'll just make those lines a little bit thicker, pretty much going over at least half of the line that we had already created with the color before it. So I'll just extend these lines out a little bit further with the BG15 and then move on to the BG13 and then back to the BG11. Now, sometimes I have a problem. I don't know whether you guys have a problem, but switching from the BG13 to the BG11, sometimes I don't get the best blend. So you can certainly do the tip to tip technique. In this case, I did not. I just went over it more than once. So I kind of went over the entire letter instead of just the highlight area to kind of get a better blend. And if that didn't work, I just went over it again. And like I said, being in such a light color, once that paper is saturated, you're not going to see the true results until the paper is dry. So give it a minute before you determine whether or not you need to add more color to it. So once my top layers or top letters were done, I'm just going to kind of speed this up a little bit and show you where I put the darkest areas for the bottom letters, but I did use the same color combination for these as well. For my Y, it's going to be again off to the bottom left. So it'll be off to the left hand side, and then that one part of the Y would be off to the left as well. For the O, I am putting shading on both sides just to kind of just give it a little bit more dimension to make it look more three-dimensional. But again, going over with the same color combination as I did for the love, the BG18, going over those same areas that we had mapped out with pretty much just straight lines, extending those lines out with the BG15, then the BG13, then the BG11. And you can see on the top now, I don't know whether you guys noticed it, but now that that ink is dried, I do have a different result. It's not as I don't have as much contrast as I did in the beginning because I went over the entire area with the BG15, so it kind of toned down that BG18, which is significantly darker. But I'm okay with that, just as long as I have a little bit of contrast and I have a better blend. So once my letters were all colored in, I wanted to kind of go around my entire image now that it's kind of like one image. I didn't want to necessarily create a shadow. I didn't want to bring in any grays. So I'm going to kind of stick to the BG markers, but I'm not going to use the darker ones. I'm going to use the BG10 and the BG 000, and I'm just going to outline the entire thing. So I'm going to start off with the BG10, and I'm just going to go around everything. Now you want to make sure, first of all, I cleaned up some smudges because I did have some smudges like I normally do. And then I'll go ahead and outline everything. Now you just want to be super careful that you don't go over the areas that you've already colored because you're going to drag out that color. The BG10 is super light, so it's going to pick up any color that it touches. The yellows you don't really necessarily have to worry about so much because they're such a light color, but especially those reds that we used for those berries, you will drag out that color if you go over it at all with the BG marker. Same thing with the green. I think that would bleed too if you weren't too careful, but it may not be as noticeable as the red, and the red is super hard to take up. So you're not necessarily going to be able to just use your colorless blender to take that up. You'd have to probably bring in a white gel pen to remove any red smears or any red smudges that you get. So once the BG10 was down and everything was outlined with that, I'll bring in the BG 000, and I'm going to go over that BG10 and just extend that out a little bit further. There wasn't too much of a difference between the colors. The BG 000 I just got. So I wasn't sure how light it was going to be in comparison to the BG10, and to be honest with you, it really wasn't much of a difference. So this part could probably be skipped completely. But once that was done, I did trim down my panel just a little bit. I noticed that my love was more to the one side than the other, and I had a lot of space down towards the bottom. So I'm going to just take a little bit off of each side as well as the bottom to make this just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. And I'm not really measuring, I'm just kind of taking a little bit off. Here I'm lining it up, figuring whether I need to take some off the bottom, and ultimately decided that it would probably be best to have a frame or at least an outline on all four sides. So here I take some fun foam that you can see that I have some Frankie teeth marks in, and I'm just cutting this. I'm using my tonic trimmer here just to cut this a little bit smaller than my card panel itself. And I'll use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this to the back of my card panel and then to the card base itself. Now, the wet glue will take a little bit of time to dry, a little bit longer than it normally does on the fun foam. So you'll see when I adhere this to my card base, it kind of slides around a little bit. You can either just hold this down until it's completely adhered, or you can put it under something heavy just for a little bit, just to make sure that it dries flat. And last, I took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and I just went over the letters. I did scribble this off on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that it wasn't flowing out too much, and just covered those letters up. And that is it. That's the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day.